junk foods, make junk brains, make junk behaviors for generations. We did a cultural anthropology look, in every other religion has the same pairing of the symbolism of fish.
Interesting.
With the psychotropic properties of the molecules of fish, which is to make people less violent and more caring. And I think that has been markedly disrupted by what's happened to our food supply for economic reasons without caring about the biology.
But there's another really interesting part of your research. Can omega-3s affect homicide and suicide rates?
As the diet changes, there's an almost perfect association.
What are omega-3s? Take us through the basics and tell us, what are they doing in the brain? How many people are actually deficient? How do we correct this deficiency?
So what we did for the U.S. military was to...
We've just done so much research around, learning issues, ADHD, dyslexia, mental health, addiction.
I don't know how much tighter data you want before you do something.
Hi, everyone. We're going to talk to Dr. Joseph Hibbeln. He is a renowned omega-3 expert and a distinguished visiting professor at the University of Bristol. And we're going to talk about omega-3's mental health, omega-3's cognitive decline. Why is our IQ going down? Why are mental health issues going up? What can we do about it? It's going to be really exciting. So thank you so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to our chat.
I'm really grateful for you inviting me, because I think that this is none other than a worldwide catastrophe for humanity, because humanity and human civilization must emanate from the brain, and the diet has changed in the brain so much in the last 100 years that it has twisted emotions, violence, interpersonal issues, because it disrupts social connections and emotions. And we need to fix it. And in order to fix it, we need to get the word out, and by intelligent people putting together good programs.
Yeah, I'm telling you, I've become a bit obsessed with omega-3s and the implications in inflammation and just mental health. So like I told you before, we're going to start with a few questions that I'm going to ask you to answer in just a few sentences. We're going to expand on it later in the chat, but just to kind of give people an overview first, how is the state of mental health in America today?
Horrific. We have exploding rates of violence and aggression, which are easy to count. We have exploding rates of depression, amplified in the public media by the COVID crisis. We have explosions in ADHD and social disconnectedness, explosions in antisocial personality disorder, and intimate partner violence. Oh, and there's drug addiction too.
Right. I didn't even mention that, but we will get to addiction and how omega-3s can help. But how much of this was related to omega-3 deficiency, and how many people are actually deficient?
So you gave me that question, so I looked up my old research where we attempted to calculate this by looking at fish consumption across 63 different countries, and try to calculate out a DRI, which would be a deficiency level, and try to calculate out an estimate of the potentially attributable risk. So it's set in with other data on cardiovascular disease well at about 30% attributable risk from omega-3 deficits.
Wow.
And potentially up to 90% or more for major depression and bipolar disorders. So that's a potentially attributable risk. And talk more about what's a recommended level omega-3 intake, and that depends on your background omega-6 intake. So for 12 different disease outcomes, we calculated a DRI, and if you were in Singapore eating low omega-3s, it's about 275 milligrams a day. If you're in the US eating a crap diet, about 4 grams a day.
Wow. Wow. That is quite a delta. That is okay. And yes, we will get into those specifics. But there's another really interesting part of your research. Can omega-3s affect homicide and suicide rates?
Right. So, I first did this work in major depression across countries, and I caught grief because, how can you diagnose major depression differently across time and countries? So I picked an outcome that even psychiatrists could diagnose. I'm a psychiatrist. And that's homicide death. So we have data on homicide death in the U.S. in 7 different countries, all the way back to the 1900s. And as the diet changes, there's an almost perfect association to increasing rates of homicide death by decreasing levels of tissue. So I was not satisfied only by that epidemiological and association. We then modeled those cross-century and cross-country differences, both in animals, so we could figure out the mechanisms. And then Adrian Raine picked up this. He's a famed investigator for violence and aggression. And we did 32 studies together. He put it together in a meta-analysis. And we can reliably reduce aggression by about 30 to 40%.
Wow.
So it's not an association. It's something where the randomized trials are concordant with the animal and basic science studies, which are concordant with these big changes over time. I don't know how much tighter data you want before you do something and intervene on a public health level with something which is not a drug. It's simply restoring brain nutrients, critical brain nutrients. It's simply restoring them into our brains and our food supply that used to always be there throughout evolution.
Yes, and I know you've done research too in inmates too, or maybe it hasn't been your research, but I've heard you talk about research done in inmates. So what would the potential be for us to reduce violence or maybe the cost to society of people being incarcerated?
Well, you're asking exactly the right question, and that is cost. I've been in this field for 40 years and publishing the research, and the scientists get excited about it. When we presented this work to the Department of Defense to change their diet, they thought it was wonderful. Congress and Senate subcommittees only cared about how much money.
Sad.
So I picked up your question for the cost of recidivism. So the best estimates are that the U.S. spends $1.2 trillion. The economic impact of recidivism is $1.2 trillion per year, both for the prison systems, for loss of work, for social disruptions, and we can probably reduce that by 30%, maybe up to 50%.
Wow.
So we're talking $200 billion
That's insane.
in economic and GOP, to say nothing of the personal trauma and the personal impacts on our families and our kids, which then have more widespread effects on our society.
That's insane. And I know you've been talking about this for a very long time. So can you give us, before we get to your story and like what brought you to this work, what would the world look like if we finally took this seriously and corrected this deficiency? And what is the hesitation? I know you've been talking about this for decades, and so many experts have. What's in the way? What's the obstacle?
So I'm going to try and answer your first question. What would the world look like? And I'm going to revert to the first dietary guidelines in the world, which I think were written in Vatican I, 1242 to 1246, which directed people who want to identify themselves as being Christian as eat fish on Wednesdays, Fridays, and all Christian feast days, which comes to about the same DRI that I calculated by other means. But I think the critical pairing here is that when you eat fish, it changes you to be more empathic, less violent, more caring for your neighbors.
We need that. Who doesn't need that today?
Gee, doesn't that sound like the main directives of Christianity?
Yes.
Oh, and by the way, we did a cultural anthropology look, and every other religion has the same pairing of the symbolism of fish.
Interesting.
With the psychotropic properties of the molecules of fish, which is to make people less violent, more caring, better. So that's what I think the world could look like. And I think that has been markedly disrupted by what's happened to our food supply for economic reasons without caring about the biology. So that's what I think the world can look like. With regards to why this hasn't changed, we run into a speculative domain.
Yeah.
And largely it's a problem that most good scientists don't know how to communicate outside of the scientific community. And that's one problem. Number two has been a cultural paradigm of psychiatry, which had a hard time moving from Freud and psychotherapy being the only answer to cognitive behavioral therapy to, pharmacology, let's make biological psychiatry. Well, pharmacological psychiatry and biological psychiatry are not the same.
Tell us the difference.
Well, you have a complex brain with hundreds of thousands of millions of molecules, millions of genes, and you expect that a pharmaceutical that's going to only touch one or two different receptors is an answer for fixing brains? A priori, that doesn't make sense to me. It's a paradigm of thinking that we have to find a specific molecular cause and a specific receptor. And I think the paradigm for biological psychiatry is to examine and understand, first of all, what are the role of the brain critical nutrients? If you have a vegetarian coming to you who's depressed, most psychiatrists do not get a vitamin B12 level. Vegetarians are frequently deficient in vitamin B12. That is a biological cause of depression. If you don't look for it, you can't see it. Iron deficiencies, other molecular deficiencies, vitamin D deficiencies, omega-3s. So just in the paradigm of nutrition in the brain, that's closer to true biological psychiatry than is pharmacological psychiatry. So we can speculate that this has been a difficulty in paradigm shifts in learning in psychiatry. We can speculate that psychiatrists get paid for prescribing medications and insurance companies reimburse them for medications, but don't necessarily reimburse for dietary guidance. And there is virtually no field of dietitians in psychiatry. There's a few out there.
Yeah.
But it's not been culturally embraced. Except, I will say, giving due credit to not only the dietary guidelines of the U.S. revised in January, but the day after they had a big rally to announce these. And every single major speaker, Secretary Kennedy, Secretary Brooks Rollins, Deputy Director of the Army, and the Director of Federal Prison Services, all made the connections publicly and broadly about the critical importance of ultra-processed foods and diets causing mental health problems.
Amazing.
It's there.
Yeah.
It's it's there. I have actually spoken directly to Secretary Kennedy about these issues and made recommendations for changing.
I love that because I know you don't know my story probably, but it was about 13 years ago now. I had depression, anxiety, substance abuse stuff, and I changed my diet for digestive reasons. And over the course of a year, my mental health changed so dramatically that I was like, what just happened? So I went back to school, and mental health and diet is kind of, I'm a little obsessed with helping people. I wish my aunt who was bipolar, I wish I had been able to help her, but I think it's such an important body of work that you've been chipping away at for decades. So that's my story. How did you get into this, Dr. Hibbeln? What's your story? Tell us.
I have a family member, a brother who's been severely mentally ill for a long time, and went to visit him. He was curled up in a closet, psychotic and babbling. My parents were the founding members of the family support group, the Depressive and Manic Depressive Association. So when I was even more arrogant than I am now, looking at medical school, I have to be an MD, PhD, and landed in a laboratory that looked at phospholipase A2, which digests fatty acids from the membranes and releases the omega-6s and omega-3s from the membrane into become biologically potent actives. And the investigator was looking at the steroids and other ways to adjust phospholipase A2. I then came to the NIH for a summer program and talked to Norman Salem, who was in the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. That, well, alcohol depletes omega-3s from the brain by half, and that's important because the brain is made of fats and lipids, and 20% of those fats and lipids have to come from our diet.
Crazy.
So if you deplete the omega-3s by half due to alcohol use, how can the brain possibly work optimally or well? It can't.
And it perpetuates it because you feel worse, right? Imagine that depletion directly affects serotonin, which makes you feel worse and maybe wanting to drink more. Could you say that's accurate?
It's absolutely well known. There's a wonderful quote from a New York Times reporter, said, I was in Finland and I had a beer, and I just felt more miserable because alcohol tends to italicize whatever mood the person is in. And it's absolutely true. When you feel miserable and you're used to drinking, yeah, that's what you do.
Yep.
Sure.
And I used to drink heavily, so I can tell you that I felt terrible and had no idea that I was depleting my precious brain fatty acids. So let's start. I wanted to pique everyone's interest and kind of get them aligned with just how broad and important your work has been. But what are omega-3s? Take us through the basics and tell us, what are they doing in the brain?
Right. So I can tell you this verbally. If you'd like, I have a few slides that can help if we want to do that.
I'd love that. Go ahead and share. I'd love that.
Okay. So here's the basics. Can you see this well?
Yes.
Okay. Here are the two critical fatty acids that are rich in seafood and rich in breast milk and rich in the brain that we're talking about. The first is EPA, which is very potently anti-inflammatory, and the critical connection to omega-3s in about, 200 different illnesses. It's got 20 carbons, 5 of them are unsaturated, these little double bonds here. First one at number 3, 1, 2, 3, from the end is omega. So that's EPA, and the other is selectively concentrated in the brain, the retina, and the testes, and that's DHA, 22 carbons long, 6 unsaturations, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 3. So, fish eat these because they eat plants in the sea that are rich either in EPA and DHA themselves or rich in this precursor. Instead of 20 carbons, it has only 18 carbons. I call this the plant type omega-3s, alpha-linolenic acid, and these are the fish type omega-3s. You can get this from plants, but it has to be converted from 18 carbons to 20 to 22, and from 3 unsaturations to 5. And there's that mechanism. So there's a competition here between the omega-6 fatty acids now swamping our diet from corn, soybean, and other fatty acids. That's the precursor to the pro-inflammatory arachidonic acid. And when you have biological derivatives of these, all these blue ones are anti-inflammatory molecules. It's a whole dump of them. And from arachidonic acid, it's largely pro-inflammatory fatty acids. But from that arachidonic acid also comes the brain's own marijuana-like molecules, 2-arachidonyl glycerol and AEA. So by changing diets, you can not only change inflammation, but you can change your brain's own marijuana-like molecules.
Which would give you less munchies? Would that make you have less of an appetite, or what would be the effects of blocking those marijuana-type molecules?
More marijuana molecules are generally associated with the munchies, and that's a whole different complex biology we're not going to get into right now. So, in evolutionary diets, we had balanced ratios of these plant-like omega-3s to the omega-6s, about 1% to 1%. And they would compete for the same enzymes to make this stuff. Omega-3 index of 8, 50-50. Now, when the world has changed from evolutionary diets in Mediterranean, now 10% of the calories are this linoleic acid, and only 1% these LAs. So the omega-6s just swamp all of these enzymes needed for, desaturation. So you get an omega-3 index of 1 just by overloading. It competes for the conversion of your own body's plant-like omega-3s to the fish-like omega-3s. I think that's pretty good. Yeah, right. So, and these were I was telling you, if you want to reach an omega-3 index of 12, I think that's best.
For the brain, or for every
for if you measure blood. If you measure blood, if you want to, reduce the burden of illnesses. In the Philippines, the amount of linoleic acid, the omega-6, is about 0.8% of calories, and you only need about 278 milligrams a day. As compared to all these countries that have higher seed oil intakes, the U.S. estimating about 9% calories from linoleic acid, so it's a little tenfold increase. So instead of 278 milligrams of omega-3 to meet the Japanese target tissue, we need almost 4 grams.
Wow.
In the U.S. So this is a huge burden on the world's fisheries, and we can fix it.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Okay.
There we go. Yeah, and I have a question for you before we get into what exactly they're doing in the brain. I had Dr. Bill Harris on the other day, and I'm sure you're familiar with his work.
Sure.
Yeah, and he believes that this omega-6 to 3 balance just doesn't really matter, and that we should just focus on omega-3s. And that's your work. So I just didn't know if you had an opinion about that.
Well, I just showed you.
Right. Yeah, and I believe that the balance.
Bill is correct that if you look globally at all of the omega-6s as a ratio to all of the omega-3s, and you lump in linoleic acid with arachidonic acid, yes, that's true. It doesn't matter. What Bill Harris does not consider is this the ability of linoleic acid to block that tube, to block the transformation from linoleic acid to EPA and DHA. So I did actually want to show you one more slide, and I don't want.
And I think he was saying if you're taking like if you're eating fish, for example, which rather than the plant forms, would that be as important?
So tissue is the issue.
Yes.
And that's a contribution that Bill Harris has in measuring the tissue and the omega-3 index. However, you can elevate that omega-3 index from a level of 1 to a level of 8 simply by backing off your omega-6 fatty acids and letting that transformation occur. My pithy way to say it is mix the 6 and you free the 3.
Ooh, I hadn't heard that. Okay, I like that.
So Bill is correct that the overall ratio is kind of hard to understand. And when you already have systems that are overloaded with linoleic acid and resembling the end of the 20th century, no, altering at a percentage point or two doesn't matter. But when you bring it back to levels of evolution of linoleic acid, which is about 1% of energy, you free the 3. And you free this conversion from the plant fatty acids to the omega-3s. So you make your 3s for free.
Much more easily. Okay, awesome. Do you have another slide you want to show us?
Here is the most direct visualization, the most direct data I have to make this point. So this is lowering dietary linoleic acid raises the omega-3 index in human beings 50, and this is enteral feeding. So these are people who can't chew and they have a tube down their throat. So you can pretty precisely
Yeah.
quantify what's going in their bodies. Backing off the linoleic acid from 13 energy percent down to 4 energy percent as a single molecule elevates the omega-3 index by 7 points.
And not changing omega-3s at all?
No.
Yeah.
See, here's EPA and DHA. No different, not detectable, not detectable, not detectable. Here's the alpha-linoleic acid, the 18 carbon one. Let's just look at these two comparisons. 1.5 energy percent, 1.1 energy percent. It's only the linoleic acid that's being reduced here. It frees up the conversion and elevates the omega-3 index.
Amazing. Okay. And then one last question on this. So he has research suggesting like linoleic acid in the blood can have beneficial impacts. Do you have anything to say about that?
The long-term dogma from the Harvard Medical School was that saturated fats elevate cholesterol, and swapping them out with polyunsaturated fats lowers cholesterol. So therefore, swapping saturates with polyunsaturates should reduce cardiovascular disease. And so my colleague Chris Ramsden rescued the data from 2 randomized placebo-controlled intervention trials where saturated fats were taken out of the diet and replaced by corn oil or omega-6 polyunsaturates. Well, the Minnesota Coronary Study did publish that this swap from saturates to corn oil polyunsaturates did lower cholesterol. They published that, right? Lowered by, what they did not publish was the next column of data over, which was risk of death. Not risk of cholesterol lowering, risk of death. And for every 200 milligrams per milliliter lower cholesterol achieved, there were proportionately higher risks of cardiovascular death. And then the same thing happened in the Sydney Dietary Heart Study. So Chris and I put together a meta-analysis of all these studies and found that if you followed the dietary advice, you would increase your risk of cardiovascular death. Mm. But, this was dogma and a religious point of view from the Harvard folks. And, it's now changed and altered in the dietary guidelines, and we're sorting it all out. So yeah, that's my opinion of the field, is going by randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials and interventions with the critical outcome of death.
Yeah, what we care about, the thing that really matters.
I like being alive.
I like it a lot better than having low cholesterol. For sure. Okay, I love that. And I know Christopher's done some work on migraines and reducing linoleic acid, and so maybe you can intro me to him. I would love to interview him as well. But take us back. The omega-3 fatty acids in the brain. What are they doing in the brain? Why are they so important? We love a little mechanism. Tell us.
Okay. 2 levels of mechanism. One is fundamental biophysics. And the second is, 3 mechanisms. Fundamental biophysics. Number 2, inflammatory processes in the brain. And number 3 is gene expression. So, number 1, first and foremost, I told you that the brain is mostly fats. I told you that 20% of the fat of the brain is, of the fats in the brain is omega-3 fatty acids, can only come from our diet. So, why is this? The retina is the best example, and the biophysics of the membrane and its fluidity are what's critical here. Imagine that one single photon of light comes into your retina and hits the rhodopsin receptor, right? That one photon changes the shape of that protein and receptor and opens up a pocket and signals into the brain. Well, hang on a second. When it changes its shape, it has to push laterally against the fatty acids in the brain. Mm. Do you want that to be made of sluggish fatty acids or exceptionally delicate, beautiful fatty acids? So those 6 double bonds in linoleic acid pull the electrons out, and that would interfere with the rotation of those bonds. So those 6 double bonds can let the molecules dance in a way that there's nothing else that replaces the physical properties. You take out one double bond from those and you get a completely different reaction, fundamental reaction of the rhodopsin being able to change from one photon of light. But then when you extrapolate that to all different neurotransmitters and all of the receptors that not only have to get signaled by a neurotransmitter, but change and create it's profound.
Right.
It's the omega-3s are also critical. They're highly concentrated in the head of sperm and highly concentrated in ovaries. And have an abundant role in sexual attraction and pleasure. This is a fundamental, pretty biologically fundamental molecule. Besides, it makes hair, skin, and nails nicer.
I love that too. And what about, I know serotonin and dopamine. I think they matter for serotonin and dopamine levels. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's not, serotonin and dopamine levels is a sort of a paradigm of thinking from psychiatry that, a drug boosts this level, lowers this level. A more fundamental issue is that neurons have to sing to each other in different parts of the brain. You have to have a song from your emotional center to your historical center to your logical center. Some of it's a conscious and unconscious. In order for that to happen, you have to have neurons connected to each other, and they get connected by what's called dendritic arborization. If you think of a tree and its roots in the soil, it's got to connect with all kinds of nutrients in the soil, or if it's in a like an aspen forest, the roots are all interconnected. The neurons get interconnected, and so a critical paradigm is what's called the dendritic arborization. How much beauty of connections do you grow? So in dopamine neurons, when you are deficient in omega-3 fatty acids, you have half as many branches and connections as compared to being sufficient. So it's not only the levels, it's the ability of the systems to interconnect with each other and form what are called connectomes, which I refer to as membrane singing. So one way I can describe this is, if you're going to make a violin, back to the biophysics, you don't want to make the violin out of plywood. You want to make the violin out of the most exquisite, maple or oak or whatever you're going to make it from. And that exquisite biophysics has to be DHA. Otherwise, entire consciousness emerging from the biophysics of the membrane up through society and interconnections to our violence and aggression and interpersonal things is altered.
Yeah. Beautiful. I love how beautifully stated that was. And before we get to practical, how do we correct this deficiency, which everybody cares about? You have just done so much research around, learning issues, ADHD, dyslexia, mental health, addiction. Can you give us some of what you think to be the most impactful and important conditions for which omega-3s can be very, very helpful?
Your first question was, how do we change it? And your second question is, what diseases and impacts do we want to change when we'll do that? And I'll get to that. So the first way to do this is to use a soybean, which is not high in omega-6s.
Interesting.
Soybeans, critically important for our economy. They fix nitrogen into the soil, and they were not any calories in 1909, and soybean oil is now 20% of all calories in the United States.
Yeah.
Percent.
Crazy.
Now, we can choose to have omega-6 fatty acids in those soybeans, or we can use natural variants, or Pioneer developed a genetic variant that knocks out one enzyme. And you have soybeans that make olive oil instead of linoleic acid. So for a worldwide and global view, I think that's the way to go. Also, what we did for the U.S. military was to change the diets of chickens.
Yes. This is what my research was on for my dissertation about beef, though, but tell us. Yeah.
On beef? Yeah. I'd like to hear about that. But we can now deliver as much omega-3 in a serving of chicken as you get in a serving of tuna.
And what are you feeding them?
What's that, please?
What are you feeding them? Linseed, flax?
Well, this is a secret.
Okay, got it. Okay. Okay. Fair.
We developed these for the military because of their interest in traumatic brain injury and suicide and depression and force efficiency and how much money we could save them. So we fed two groups the same recipes, the same menu cycle for 2 weeks, but swapped out regular chicken, placebo chicken with omega-3 chicken, a few other different foods, and in 10 weeks brought them to Mediterranean levels of the omega-3 index, right?
And that's so cool because chicken is by far the most consumed protein. Is that why you went after chicken?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Yeah, I love your global perspective, right? We're all used to hearing, okay, take your fish oil, eat your fish, and those are important too. But I like these bigger swings that you're talking about. That's really cool.
Yeah, because ultimately it's not what you eat. Ultimately, tissue is the issue. So that's how I think we can do it. And we can readily change the diets of prisoners, change the diets of school children. I had 10 minutes with Secretary Kennedy and condensed the science in 10 minutes and had a to-do plan. And that is use the USDA funded programs for school breakfasts and school lunches and after school programs, serve the same recipes and do what we did in the military, and just correct the nutrient content
I love it.
of those foods. Everything that clucks does not have the same nutrition. Everything that clucks does not have the same nutrition. Chickens are now raised indoors in barns that may have 200 or 600,000 chickens in them, and they have to supplement the feed with vitamins and minerals because they're basically feeding chickens junk food. And
I don't,
and they get no vitamin D. So we can fix it.
we can
We have-
absolutely
we have
fix
the
it.
tools.
We do, and I don't even know if you know, we have a regenerative meat delivery service where we do that. We, feed animals a species appropriate diet, grass, feed it regeneratively, botanically diverse, right? And you watch those fatty acids change dramatically, especially in chicken and pork. And because those ratios are really high, like 20-1 to 30-1 in chicken and pork, and even grain-fed beef is like 8-1. So like chicken and pork, you're right. That's where the big needle movers are, and especially chicken. So that's really cool. Now, do you also eat seafood regularly, or do you supplement?
Oh, I do both.
Yeah, yeah.
I usually have a seafood dinner 2 or 3 times a week. Often have tinned fish for lunch, and then just take about 6 grams a day of EPA.
Just 6 grams. Okay. 6 grams. Okay. That's pretty good. I've been getting into herring because I can literally feel the energy for some reason when I eat herring and mackerel. Herring and mackerel seem to do it for me. Do you have a favorite fish you're working with these days?
Fresh fish and fish that's in front of me are my favorite.
You're just whatever.
It does bring to mind, roasted Mediterranean sardines that are fairly large, and eating them in Portugal and Spain.
Yeah.
You get what you can, right?
Yeah, you don't need to be picky. And I know that you were part of this. Mercury, not really something to be concerned about, especially if you're pregnant, right? We need to prioritize fish consumption over the fear of mercury.
Okay, so here's the bottom line. The calculation done in 2000 by the National Academy of Sciences on a couple of hundred women eating pilot whale to derive a mercury level that we should use as a reference was a bizarre calculation.
Yes, to say it mildly.
They couldn't find a no effects level, so then they decided to launch off from a point of departure. You're thinking, point of departure, what does that mean in toxicity? It means nothing. So from the point of departure, they also added a tenfold uncertainty factor. Not a safety factor, tenfold. Why tenfold? Because you've got 10 fingers, right? And then made something called a reference dose and decided that that's a toxicological level of mercury from fish. So not only was the calculation bizarre, and it had nothing to do with lower levels of IQ, even of women eating pilot whale, but it completely neglected calculating in the beneficial effects of fish, or conversely, the harmful effects of creating a deficiency in pregnancy when the brain's getting formed.
Yeah.
So in 2009, we did a nasty thing. We actually tested the dietary advice to see if it was doing what it was supposed to do. So we looked at 15,000 pregnant women and their kids have been followed up to 10 years of age. And we put them in 3 groups. Those that ate more fish than was advised, more than 12 ounces a week. Those who ate between 12 and none. If women followed the dietary advice based on this bizarre calculation, it doubled the risk of low IQ in their children. It doubled the risk of low IQ in their children because they completely neglected the harm of excluding fish from the diet of pregnant women.
Wow.
And we think that the EPA probably had a big hand in this because it was politically important to show that they were, reducing toxicity of something, and completely ignored the harms. And nobody's been able to refute that data. Mm. And subsequent dietary advice said, oh, you should consider the benefits of eating fish in pregnancy, and then completely neglected to add any benefits of pregnancy into the calculations. Wow. So this business of high mercury fish, low mercury fish, it's completely made up.
Wow.
And it's completely bizarre based on this reference dose, which is a nonsense number.
Wow. Well, thank you for clearing that up. I can't even tell you how many women I work with that are worried about that still, unfortunately, today. Okay. Do you have time for 2 more questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Before we get to, I want to hear what the strongest evidence is around omega-3s and which conditions. But first, EPA, DHA, DPA. Do you have a favorite? If someone is supplementing, do you have one that you would prioritize when you're taking your 6 grams? What's the breakdown? Do you think it matters for mental health specifically and brain health?
The data come from a meta-analysis by Brian Hallahan, finding that for depression, and it really extends to most other illnesses, more EPA than DHA, which you'd find in fish. And we believe that it's primarily impacting the neuroinflammation in the brain. And when you elevate the neuroinflammation of the brain, it's going to magnify whatever mental illness you are predisposed to have. If you're predisposed to depression, it's going to amplify depression. Bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, aggression and violence, it's going to amplify it. So it's simple as eat a supplement that reflects the natural contents of fish, which is higher EPA than DHA. I haven't found any really good data using algal DHA alone in psychiatric bits. That was one question, right?
Yeah, no, that was just it. Because that's what I've noticed too in depression. And I'm wondering about for like neurocognitive decline, if that might be different and that you might want more DHA, or if there's any good evidence in that. Because I did see that EPA for depression. But I do know certain fish are higher in DHA and fish roe is higher in DHA. So just wondering about your perspective. But also, can we talk about, I have both genes for Alzheimer's. And so if you were me, would you still be prioritizing EPA, even if you don't have like elevated inflammatory markers?
I don't have that granular information about the interaction of EPA versus DHA in relationship to different variants of Alzheimer's genes. It's a little bit too granular for
I get that.
I can tell you. In general, neural inflammation is bad for Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. Especially, when you have the vascular component with EPA and DHA helping blood flow and blood vessel health, you don't want bad blood. You don't want bad blood in your brain or low oxygen blood when you're predisposed. And life is not only a line; it's not only a one-dimensional lifeline, right? A life should also be considered at least as a tube, a 3-dimensional tube, and perhaps as a bugle. So you not only want to have a longer life, you want to have a life that amplifies itself as you grow.
I love that. I love that. Okay, well, my last question for you then is just take us on a tour of the most impactful intervention studies that you've been a part of for, bipolar, schizophrenia, dyslexia, ADHD, I mean, violent crime, you've done it all. So can you tell empathy, where do you think omega-3s are the most impactful?
So the best example I can give you is this, and I'll tell you. We gave omega-3 fatty acids to kids and reduced their aggression by 50%. The parents didn't take the omega-3s, and their psychopathology and interpersonal violence went down by about 30%. So this shows not only a direct effect of the omega-3s on the kids, but a spreading societal effect in families, reducing psychopathology and violence. So you had asked me a question in your notes about bipolar disorder, and about empathy.
Yeah.
The opposite of empathy is antisocial behavior. That can be reduced by about 40-50% with omega-3 fatty acids. So when you think of a society that has 40 or 50% less antisocial, impulsive, and aggressive behaviors, there's a very wide spreading cultural effect and impact. So again, this sort of gets back to the original dietary guidelines, the first of the dietary guidelines, 1242, 1246, which if the world followed now based on molecular reasoning, we would not only have less antisocial behavior, less aggression, and more empathy, we would also have greater art. We would have greater beauty. We would have greater social connectedness. And all of those things which make us exquisite, which is so exquisite and beautiful for the species of Homo sapiens. So that's, we can focus on one illness or one condition at a time, or we can focus on the spreading benefits to the entire society of better empathy and better respect for each other.
What a beautiful place to end. And I just think we could have so many more conversations, and you've done such, like I said, I've alluded to such an extensive body of work, as prestigious as it gets. Now, tell people, where can they learn more about what you're doing and what's next for you?
Right. So I think currently one of my favorite websites is the Food and Behavior Research, FAB Research, at the University of Oxford, headed for 20 more years by Alex Richardson. It has clear information, and make a contribution to that. Keep that going. What's next for me? I'm transitioning from knowing to doing. As my father said, it's not what you know, it's what you do with what you know. And so now I'm learning the language of economics and learning the language of politics, and trying to get, my new goal is basically get more of these molecules into people's minds, and emphasize the overall message that junk foods make junk brains, make junk behaviors for generations.
Beautiful. What a mission. I don't think there's a more important mission. I really do. I think that kind of like getting people on the right track to feeding their brains, feeding their bodies, it can and will change the world. So thank you for all the work you're doing in that. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you'll come back soon.
I hope we'll come back, and I want to hear more about your work and what you've done with the animals and the feeding, and we'll talk about that offline. And just, as a psychiatric perspective, I also want to note that there's probably a reason why we named, an unconscious reason why we named them junk foods. Because probably the molecular composition of the foods changed our emotional reaction to them, and we unconsciously paired and named them as junk foods.
I love it. I love that. I couldn't agree more. And I can't wait till our next conversation. So thank you. Thank you very much.